The BBC had a policy about British television, a formal, official, written-down policy, and that policy was to destroy its own television archive. Not accidentally, not through fire or flood, but deliberately, systematically, reel by reel, decade by decade, erasing some of the most creative television ever made in Britain. Storing the tapes cost money, and repeating the shows carried contractual complications, so the accountants signed off on wiping them. The unions that existed to protect performers had negotiated deals that made reruns difficult, which meant old footage carried no commercial value, which meant the destruction orders kept coming. The very system designed to protect artists ended up erasing their work, and that's the kind of irony that doesn't need exaggerating. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of everything the BBC produced from the mid-1950s through to the mid-1970s is gone. ITV isn't innocent either. Thames Television wiped their early archives, HTV wiped theirs, and the 2-inch quadruplex videotape used across British broadcasting cost serious money per reel in 1970s terms, each reel running to several £100s at period prices, which made the economics of wiping and reusing them straightforward to justify on a spreadsheet. Not every broadcaster made that choice. Granada Television, for instance, retained their archive including Coronation Street from the beginning, which stands as a useful counterexample to the idea that wiping was simply inevitable. The BBC didn't formally stop the practice until 1978, and the requirement to actually preserve material wasn't written into their charter until 1981. Much of the credit for that policy shift belongs to Sue Malden, the BBC television archive selector appointed in 1979, whose persistent institutional advocacy helped establish preservation as a formal obligation rather than an afterthought. Some of what survived did so entirely by accident through a BBC employee who refused to follow orders, a foreign broadcaster who quietly kept a copy, or a film library in Nigeria where staff ignored direct instructions to burn the cans. That last situation saved 9 missing episodes of Doctor Who in 2013, when researcher Philip Morris tracked them down in Joss. The greatest television archivists of that era were, in several cases, people who simply didn't do what they were told, and I find that genuinely satisfying. Organizations like Kaleidoscope, the British Television Archive Recovery Group, have spent decades chasing down copies held by foreign broadcasters, private collectors, and regional film libraries, and their work, alongside the BFI National Archive, is the reason any of the recovery stories in this video are possible. The BFI and BBC also jointly stage Missing Believed Wiped, an annual screening event where newly recovered or rarely seen material is presented publicly, and the title captures the situation precisely: not confirmed destroyed, just gone from the record until someone finds a copy somewhere unexpected. What follows are 10 British television shows from the 1970s that either vanished entirely, exist only in fragments, or faded so completely from public consciousness that most viewers under 50 have never heard of them. Some carry fascinating automotive or production angles that connect directly to the Hollywood and classic vehicle world. All of them deserved better. Ace of Wands ran on ITV between July 1970 and November 1972, and 26 of its 46 episodes no longer exist because Thames Television wiped the first 2 complete series. The third series survives and has been released on DVD, which means you can watch how the show ended, but not how it began. A genuinely strange viewing experience for anyone who tries to approach it in order. Created by Trevor Preston, whose other credits included Callan, Public Eye, and Special Branch, the show followed a stage magician who used his skills to investigate supernatural crimes, sitting tonally somewhere between Doctor Who and the Avengers. You'd think a creator with that track record would produce something slick and generously funded, but Ace of Wands operated closer to low-budget curio territory, and at its peak, it still drew millions of viewers across Britain. The wiped episodes represent a real loss because the surviving third series demonstrates genuine craft throughout. The production design, the staging of illusion sequences, The way the team handled light and shadow on cramped studio sets, all of it points to a crew working at the limits of their budget in interesting ways. A fan convention held in 2025 marked the show's enduring appeal among those who remember it, and the audiences at those events tend to be older, smaller every year, and increasingly aware that the tapes simply aren't coming back. Doomwatch arrived in 1970 with serious creative pedigree behind it, co-created by Kit Pedler and Gerry Davis, the same pair responsible for inventing the Cybermen for Doctor Who. The BBC understood what they had, and the show rewarded that confidence by drawing 13.6 million viewers at its peak, with Robert Powell in an early career role before international recognition arrived through Jesus of Nazareth in 1977. 38 episodes were produced, and 14 are missing because the BBC wiped them, which makes the frustration here particularly sharp. A 1970 episode of Doomwatch featured a virus that consumed plastic, causing aircraft components to fail in flight, and that episode aired more than 50 years before microplastic contamination became a recognized global crisis. The show consistently ran ahead of real scientific anxiety, and the episodes most likely to feel prescient today are often the ones that no longer exist. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation inadvertently saved the entire second series by purchasing the rights and retaining their copies when the BBC destroyed the masters, and one episode titled Sex and Violence was never transmitted at all. A 1972 film adaptation produced by Tygon British Film Productions eventually reached American audiences in 1976, placed on a triple bill with two horror films under the title Island of the Ghouls. That's quite a landing for a show that once pulled nearly 14 million viewers on a Tuesday night. The Protectors carries the clearest credentials for this channel's audience, and it remains largely unknown outside dedicated British television circles. Gerry Anderson produced it through his Group 3 Productions for ITC Entertainment, and yes, this is the same Gerry Anderson of Thunderbirds and Marionettes, stretching into live-action international thriller territory with genuine ambition. Robert Vaughn headed the cast. The American star of The Man from UNCLE played a sophisticated freelance agent across 52 episodes of 25-minute action television, filmed on location across Rome, Paris, Malta, Venice, Salzburg, and London. The European shooting schedule gave the show a James Bond aesthetic on what was clearly not a James Bond budget, and somehow it worked. Vaughn's character, Harry Rule, drove a Jensen Interceptor, one of the most visually striking British Grand Tourers ever built. The initial cars used a Chrysler 383 cubic inch V8, the 6.3-liter unit, before Jensen moved to the larger 440 cubic inch, 7.2-liter engine from 1971 onward. The engine sat inside coachwork styled by Vignale and manufactured in West Bromwich. The Jensen Interceptor looked like something a Hollywood producer would park outside a Monaco casino, which was essentially the entire point of the casting choice. Early 1970s, Jensen Interceptors in good condition were selling in the £150,000 to £300,000 range at auction as of 2024 to 2025, reflecting the car's enduring reputation among collectors. Tony Christie sang the theme Avenues and Alleyways. The show is available on DVD, ITVX, and YouTube, and it deserves a considerably larger audience than it currently commands. Speaking of action series with interesting vehicle choices, the next one involves a product placement deal that looks more complicated the longer you think about it. The new Avengers arrived in 1976 as a revival of the classic 1960s series, starring Patrick Macnee alongside Joanna Lumley and Gareth Hunt across 26 episodes, with British Leyland supplying the vehicles. That sentence contains more irony than any single sentence in this script should reasonably be permitted to carry. British Leyland in 1976 was a nationalized automotive company in severe industrial difficulty, producing cars that had become internationally associated with quality problems, and the vehicles supplied to the production included a Jaguar XJ 5.3C, an XJS, a Rover 3500 SD1, a Range Rover, an MGB, and a Triumph TR7. Gareth Hunt's character Gambit drove the Rover SD1, which looked excellent on camera and represented precisely the kind of aspirational British motoring the sponsorship deal was designed to promote. Whether the cars started reliably on cold location mornings is a question the production notes do not fully address, and probably for good reason. Cancellation after 2 series came not from audience indifference, but from the collapse of the co-production financing structure that required ongoing partnerships with French and Canadian broadcasters, and sustaining that arrangement proved impossible. Joanna Lumley went on to absolutely fabulous and global fame, the show quietly disappeared, and the Rover SD1 is now a sought-after classic, appreciated for exactly the design qualities that made it a credible action vehicle 40-odd years ago. Terry Nation created the Daleks, and he also created Survivors and Blake's 7, which suggests a man with a consistent and somewhat focused interest in scenarios where civilization is either under sustained attack or has already collapsed entirely. Survivors ran from 1975 to 1977 across 38 episodes, depicting Britain after a pandemic killed most of the population, and every episode survives. The show is simply forgotten. A BBC revival ran from 2008 to 2010 before cancellation after 12 episodes across 2 series, but the original is sharper, stranger, and more unsettling, partly because it was shot on location across genuinely empty rural England and Wales with minimal studio work. That practical production approach gives the series a texture that later versions couldn't replicate on a more conventional schedule, and the difference is visible within minutes of comparing them. Nation departed after the first series over creative disagreements with producer Terence Dudley, feeling the show was drifting from his original vision toward domestic drama, and he was probably right. The episodes most closely tied to his involvement carry a bleakness that the later series deliberately softened, and the pandemic premise that once read as extreme science fiction now functions more like a quiet historical document. This next one is almost the opposite of a production where ambitions outran the budget. Timeslip ran across 26 episodes from October 1970 to April 1971, produced by ATV for ITV, following 2 children who discover a time barrier near a disused naval research station and travel through it to reach the Second World War, a near-future 1990, and eventually an Ice Age scenario. The show treated its young audience as intelligent enough to follow genuinely complicated science fiction plotting, which was a rarer creative decision in 1970 than it sounds. Every episode survives, and they survive because a TV transferred the series to 16mm film for overseas sales, which inadvertently preserved the master recordings when the original tapes might otherwise have been wiped. The show is unavailable on Region 1 DVD and virtually unknown outside the UK, which means an intact archive of confident 1970s British science fiction sits accessible and largely unnoticed by most of the world. Real naval locations gave the production an atmospheric weight that studio-bound shows of the era rarely achieved, and the direction leaned into the disorienting quality of the time barrier sequences in ways that hold up surprisingly well. Watching clips of this, I was genuinely surprised by the confidence of the lead performances and the refusal of the writers to condescend to their audience. One series was produced, then the show was replaced by something cheaper. Based on Peter Dickinson's trilogy of novels, The Changes ran across 10 episodes in 1975 with a premise that lands harder now than it did at broadcast. Something causes the entire British population to develop a sudden, violent, irrational hatred of all technology and machinery, driving people to smash televisions, tear up telephone wires, abandon vehicles, and burn factories, while a teenage girl travels through a Britain reverting toward a pre-industrial state, trying to understand what triggered the collapse. The BBC filmed scenes of vehicles from the 1970s being attacked by mobs and burned in fields, period-correct British cars that were entirely contemporary and familiar at the time of broadcast, the kind of Cortinas and Marinas filling British roads in 1975, physically destroyed on camera. There's something genuinely unsettling about watching those vehicles treated that way now, partly because those same cars are precisely what serious collectors are currently hunting down and restoring at considerable expense. The BFI National Archive released the complete series on DVD in 2014, and the anti-technology premise that read as science fiction in 1975 now sits comfortably alongside current conversations about artificial intelligence, algorithmic dependency, and smartphone culture. Almost nobody has seen it, and that gap between the show's ideas and its current invisibility is one of the stranger ironies on this list. Special Branch ran from 1969 to 1974 across 53 episodes produced by Thames Television, following officers of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch through police and espionage territory that kept audiences returning across 4 series. The first 2 series, shot in black and white, are entirely gone because Thames wiped them, and the 3rd and 4th series survive in color and remain available on DVD. For anyone interested in period British automotive culture in operational use, the surviving episodes function as a genuine time capsule. Ford Cortinas in pursuit sequences, Rover P6s deployed as surveillance vehicles, Triumph 2000s parked outside government buildings, none of them glamorous choices, all of them accurate to what plainclothes officers actually drove, and that authenticity gives the show a texture that flashier contemporaries lack. Patrick Mower's character, D.I. Haggerty, drove a Triumph Stag in several episodes, a genuinely aspirational choice for a police procedural, and the Stag brought its own complications to screen without anyone needing to script them. With its twin overhead cam Phi 8 developing around 145 brake horsepower, the Stag was a real driver's car undermined throughout its production life by well-documented cooling system fragility, and good examples were selling in the 25,000 to 45,000 pounds range in the 2024 market. The episodes featuring the Stag now function as period documents of a car that spent most of its existence fighting its own reputation. That's nothing compared to what comes next, a show so thoroughly erased that even its plot details remain disputed. The Clifton House Mystery was produced by HTV West and broadcast in 1978 as a 6-episode children's serial following a family who moves into a Georgian house in Bristol and discovers a ghost connected to the history of the transatlantic slave trade. By any measure, this was one of the earliest British television dramas for any audience of any age to address that history directly, and it was made for children. HTV filmed on the actual streets and within the real architecture of Clifton, Bristol, using a neighborhood with genuine historical connections to the trade the story addressed as its primary visual setting. And that choice gives the surviving clips an atmospheric weight that studio-bound productions of the era rarely achieved. The production design worked with the location rather than around it, and the result carries a seriousness that distinguishes it from most children's television of the period. The show was rarely repeated, never released commercially, and has effectively vanished from accessible archives. A 1978 children's drama addressing the slave trade with more directness than most adult programming of its era does not surface on streaming platforms or in retrospective collections. It is simply not there anymore, and given the subject matter, the early date, and the intended audience, that absence represents a meaningful cultural loss. Man-Dog broadcast in January 1972 and returned for a repeat run in June 1973. It was a 6-part children's serial involving travelers from the future. Beyond that, the factual record becomes genuinely difficult to pin down. The series is believed to be entirely wiped from the BBC archive. No episodes are known to survive, and even confirmed plot details are sparse enough that the show now exists primarily as a name on nostalgia forum threads where people debate whether they actually remember watching it or whether they are confusing it with something else entirely. That detail is more haunting than anything else on this list. Shows with missing episodes are frustrating, but a show where even the basic facts remain uncertain has crossed into something stranger, a piece of television that essentially unexists, except as a childhood memory that can no longer be verified against anything real. The BBC's tape-wiping era created dozens of situations exactly like this, and the 1978 policy change arrived too late for Man-Dog and for hundreds of other productions. The ones that survived often did so through luck, accident, or outright defiance of instructions, and the ones that didn't are simply gone not partially gone, not recoverable with effort, just absent from the record entirely. The pattern across these 10 shows tells you everything about how broadcast television viewed its own history in the 1970s, which is to say, it didn't. Old tape meant storage costs and union complications. Cultural losses took decades to fully understand, and some of them cannot be measured at all because we do not know precisely what we are missing. The work of recovery continues through organizations like Kaleidoscope and the BFI National Archive, and through events like Missing Believed Wiped, where the occasional miracle still happens, such as a foreign broadcaster's dusty shelf, a collector's garage, or a film library that ignored the destruction order. That gap between what was made and what survives is the real story here, and it is considerably larger than most people realize. The stories of productions that survived against the odds, and the ones that did not, are exactly what this channel keeps digging into. If that gap interests you, you are already in the right place.